Hello, this is John Jughead Pierson, and you're about to watch and or listen to the first installment of my reading of Weasels in a Box, my first novel. Um, I I am in the process of actually turning it into an ebook, and I was sitting with my sort of co-producer on my publishing company, Hope and Non Things, Diana Slickman, and she keeps on trying to push me to get this thing done. And I had my friend Sarah Ramon. She's actually edited it twice for me because I lost the first one, and then she took the time to redo it again. And then I'm supposed to be getting it. Then I had another friend actually put it into PDF form to get ready to just send to someone to turn it into an ebook. But I keep on hesitating to get it out there, and I'm not sure why. Maybe I'm not proud of it anymore, or maybe I think there's too many. It's about having bad memory. That's part of it, and it's very surreal because it's to me more of an emotional journey than a purely accurate depiction of the band. Although a lot of the situation, mostly all the situations happened, but as the specifics, I'll get wrong, and I'll point out some of those in the readings that I do. Um, but I was sitting with my friend Diana Slickman the other night, and she asked me, "So, are you getting that book out?" And I was like, I just don't think I can do it. And she's like, "You just don't like it anymore?" I know, some authors do that. They go through periods like that. And yes, and I don't want to rewrite the whole thing, but I said I want to put out an ebook where you can like press on a word or something, and it'll send you into another section where I can explain further, or point out some interesting things, because a lot of people ask about who I'm talking about, and now I'm not so shy to say who I was talking about. I wasn't then either. I just wanted it to be a novel, so that to me meant instead of it being a tour diary, I needed to use like fake names and have some surreal sort of things happen, or I knew surreal things were going to happen, so it shouldn't just be a tour diary. Um, and then she looked at me and said, "John, that's really difficult and expensive, way more than just turning it into an ebook." And she said, "Why don't you just do a podcast or something about it?" And I said, "Yeah, you're pretty smart, Slickman." So this is that. This is the first installment. I just read the preface, and I'd like people to reply in the comments below if they actually like this process, if this seems interesting to them. The next step might be to continue onwards with the YouTube version of it, or my girlfriend is actually trying to get me to start doing Twitch, which is interesting for this book because maybe each night I do this like once a week, because you have to actually have a specific time you do it, and people live watch and respond. And why I like the idea is why I started my first podcast with Jughead's Basement is I liked the idea of people being able to correspond immediately, but it wasn't working with that, so I turned that more into a podcast that people just downloaded and listened to. But I want to be involved in some sort of communication via the internet, and being able to see and hear that is in the moment. So the idea of doing it on Twitch is kind of exciting because people can respond to me in the moment, and I can respond back to them and answer questions while I'm reading. So that is exciting. So I'd like to know if people are up for that. And with that, there. To be honest, I'm trying. It would be nice to get, since I might not release it as an ebook, or maybe to raise the money to put it out the way I want. You can actually donate in Twitch while you're watching something, so that might actually help me to make this thing actually happen. Or the other idea is just to release it on YouTube like I'm doing now. So let me know your opinions. I think overall I will, no matter what, release it as a podcast, maybe a sub podcast of Jughead's Basement, which I'm also doing another sub podcast, which I've only got one out with Mr. Deeds, Grim Deeds, but I plan on doing more of those. I actually have one now in the works with Bill the Punk Rock Cop, who is a local cop and a punk rocker around here. Very genuine, kind, nice man, and I wanted to get him talking about what it is like nowadays to be a police officer. But anyway, so just give me your opinions on it. So here is the first attempt at this YouTube videoing of me reading my book, Weasels in a Box. And this is the preface. So here we go. The front matter, supposed to be on 2005 by John Jughead Pierson. This might be right when I started using that full name. And the cover art by was Les Toyle. He's also the one who did the cover for Bark Like a Dog, I think. Maybe even Teen Punks and Heat. I don't know. I'll look it up and put it in the notes. All right, preface. I had decided to join the world of zines and write my first article. I was a big fan of a band called the Lillingtons. I still am a big fan. They are friends of mine. I thought the band and its members had an integrity I rarely see anymore. A dedication to ideas that can make you look foolish in the eyes of the fast-moving mainstream. They pursued a sound that harkened back to when I first started playing music. But like all good bands, they allowed those influences to bounce off their own identities to create something individual. So I thought they were worthy of being the subjects of my first attempt at being a journalist. I still think that to this day. I showed an outline of the article to my friend Anita Loomis, and she said, "This isn't an article. It's the beginning of a book about your band." I took the pages out of her hands. I shot her a shocked, nasty stare, and then looked at the pages again. I had already been working on another book called Hats Off, still am, for the past 10 years, maybe now 20. The idea of allowing another one to barricade itself in my brain with the former one still in there was not very appealing, but she was right. Actually, I still haven't finished that one. My second novel is actually I forgot the name of that book. What is it? Clarence Oddbody is what we call it now. That's a character from It's a Wonderful Life, but it's the Last Temptation of Clarence Oddbody. It was a mixture of I was mixing the movie Last Temptation of Christ, which was also a novel originally, and the name Clarence Oddbody, who is the guardian angel of Jimmy Stewart in It's a Wonderful Life. What I was going to say here is that what I don't think I talk about in this is that I was living with Anita Loomis, and we were in Andersonville, and I sent Ben an email about wanting to tour more, about how it was I was upset because we weren't touring much, and that was one of my big responsibilities in a band, was being in charge of that stuff. And I wrote him an email about how he had always said that we were equals in the band and that there was no band without him or me. And I thought it would only fair that he would reconsider touring. And he wrote me back a very long, pretty hostile letter about talking about how I was just pulling a guilt trip on him and that I wasn't being apathetic, well, wasn't being sympathetic to his anxieties and stuff like that. So it kind of was the beginning of the end, and I think that had been in my mind probably when I was trying to write something about the Lillingtons, because I guess I saw them as how maybe a Weasel had been in the beginning days, sort of exciting and new. But now let me read on. For some reason, I started the book in second person point of view. I don't know why. It's not a very good format for a book. It is a style known for being very difficult, annoying, and some say actually absurdly impossible. I tend to agree with all the aforementioned, and that is why I couldn't get the idea of using it out of my head. With all said and done, I enjoy the challenge, but will never write in that tedious style again. I think I succeeded within my own conception of second person, but I will admit that it is more of a 1.5 person point of view in the eyes of the others. I don't even know if that is possible. Yeah, I think I wanted to do it in first person because, in second person. I had studied literature in school, and I had read a couple books in second person, and I didn't really enjoy that take. So I thought it was sort of a challenge. And I also, the irony that might have been lost on a lot of people is I wasn't trying to put the audience into my place. I was trying to point up the absurdity, since I thought second person was kind of an absurd style of writing. It could be good for like cookbooks and things like that, where it's saying, hey, you need to pour this in there and you need to do this. But for a novel, I have mixed feelings about it. So the idea was that it was supposed to be absurd that I was doing that and pull you out of the book, so that sort of playing with the metaphor that even me, myself, was being pulled out of myself. So even I wasn't the first person, if that makes any sense at all. But I can't complain. A lot of people, once they got into the book, because it's a hard book to start, they said they actually enjoyed that and they felt like they were there. It's contrary to the idea that I had about it, but I can't complain. If that's the way they read it and they liked it, then great. So I go on. The book wrote itself pretty easily for the first year, and then I gave up. What was I thinking, trying to fit all of my feelings about my band for the last 12 to 15 years into a book, my first book? I had less toil designed the book cover to help inspire me to continue on. That worked for another year, and then I gave up. Again. I gave a few chapters to Ben Weasel, and he thought it was pretty good. He liked the idea of another opinion of Screeching Weasel being out there in the world besides his own. This inspired me once again, and when the band played its last show at the House of Blues in Chicago, I took the money and flew to Europe. The plan was to distance myself metaphorically by distancing myself literally from where all the history took place. Screeching Weasel had never made it to Europe, but little did I know that the band had a booming history there in many parts of Europe in the present tense. Yes. So Ben saying another opinion in the band. He had been also the most prolific writer in the band, working for Maximum Rock and Roll. But also, I think he was referring to, or I'm referring to, also his book Like Hell, which my book is actually in part a response to many of the topics in his fictional take on Screeching Weasel. Before leaving the U.S., I took advantage of a schmoozing technique I had never used before. I used the power of being in a pretty well-known band to help me find places to stay. I sent out announcements on punk message boards that I was going to travel Europe to finish my book. I said that I would gladly meet some punks in pubs in the many areas I planned to stay. I got responses from Dublin, Ireland, Edinburgh, Scotland, Antwerp, Belgium, and Rotterdam in the Netherlands, just to name a few. A flood of responses came from Italy. It made me very happy to hear from the Italians, because another of my favorite bands lived in northern Italy, the Mangies. I mapped out my journey, started in Ireland, the land of cell phones and bars, and stayed with Colum and Noel. Then to Scotland, the land of golf and beautiful graves and castles, where I stayed with Simon and Dawn. Simon, actually, I met Simon earlier when I was in the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. I was with my group Sheila at that time. No, I was with the Neo Futures. Too Much Light Makes the Baby Go Blind, and I put out a message that I needed an acoustic guitar, and Simon contacted me and showed up. I think he lived like 2 hours outside of Edinburgh, and he was with his wife at the time, Dawn. So that's where I first met Simon, and then Simon flew out to see this. Right, yeah, wow. So this book started before the House of Blues shows, and then by the time I finally finished it, the House of Blues shows had happened, and so it incorporated later stuff where Simon actually flew out to see those shows, and then ended up moving here to Chicago, and then became good friends with Vapid, and then actually took my place in Weasel. And then we had a falling out, and then I apologized to him and Vapid, and we all got back together as friends, and now Simon is in pretty much any project that Vapid does, still living in or near Chicago. Okay, now let me go on here. So Simon and Dawn, then to Antwerp, where I stayed with the calm, soft-spoken man dressed all in black, David Vriki, who lived in a house built in the 1400s. Actually, he's remained a good friend of mine over these many, many years. Jeez, so many years now. I'm actually going to stay with him in a couple weeks before we head out to the Raduno Festival in Bergamo, Italy, which is hosted by one of the hosts and producers of it is Andrea from the Mangies. So then up to Rotterdam, the land of stolen bicycles surrounded by awesome windmills with the apers. I actually had an experience there where I guess there was a thing where you just would buy a bike for like a couple bucks on the street, and then you would just dump it somewhere else and steal it, because that's kind of the culture they built around it. They turned the stealing of bikes into sort of an economic social experiment. So you didn't have your own bike. You just sort of expected that someone was going to steal this one you bought for really cheap. And it was just like, maybe the earlier form of Uber. And then I took the long train trip south to Italy to stay with the Mangies and the Pee-wees, where I drank lemon and vodkas at a punk rock club called La Scaletta and ate wonderful 4-course meals at a similarly named place on the other side of town called La Scaletta. While in Italy, I heard of a wonderful group of people who lived in Palermo, Sicily. I hopped on a train and stayed there with Bizio. I used all his water supply for a week by taking only one shower. That is true. He let me stay in his bedroom with a fresco on the ceiling. He cooked me food and then criticized and laughed at me for combining my primo pasta with my secundo sausage. He is a special man. The thing was that they had a shortage of water there, and I didn't know that, so I accidentally used all the water in one shower. And he didn't even tell me that. One of the other friends that was staying there said, I think it was my friend Marco, actually said, you used all his water and he's got a child. And I was like, I didn't know. And I felt so bad that I'd never showered again. And then I eventually got them all, my friends Stefanino and Marco found me a place that I could stay in by myself that was really cheap. But it was really cool. It was actually I might have talked about it later in there, but it was a really cool sort of a penthouse. They had this huge outside area, but it was really cheap. I think it was like the equivalent of like $200 a week for me. So we go on. Then Marco and Stefanino found me a cheap, amazing hotel room that had a patio the size of my house back home, where I actually did quite a bit of writing of this book. I then convinced Mass and Giorgio to travel from La Spezia to Palermo, 12 hours in a car, where we then stayed in Paulo's house, the anarchist bank teller anti-American who owns more American records than anybody I have ever met. That's enough. Eventually, the popsters, who Paolo and Stefanino were both in the band. They were also from a band called Sempre Freschi, which kind of means fresh bread. So they actually toured with Even and Blackouts years and years later, and stayed at my house a lot. The excursion was to end in Spain. I didn't know anybody there, but I liked the idea of renting a cabin on the southern coast of Spain to finish the epic journey and novel. The folks treated me so well in Italy and Sicily that I never made it to Spain. I was actually in Pisa looking at the Leaning Tower when the towers in New York were being attacked. Massa, the Mangies, and I peeked into a pizza restaurant and saw the towers fall on television. I was literally half in and half out the door, one eye on the TV and one eye on the Tower of Pisa. That was surreal, sad, and educational. I didn't want to leave Italy, and at the time, it was impossible to leave anyway because of security. Yeah, so I had been there during the 9/11 falling of the towers, and I went back there a couple times with Mass since then, and that pizza place still has the TV there, but it's nowhere. You can't actually see the tower from halfway in the door. So I don't know how that memory was created in my head, but that goes to show that my memory is sometimes creative and surreal, and combined, I think what probably really happened, I think me and Mass talked about this, is that we saw it on the television, the towers falling, and then we walked down the street and we're going to stop in another place, and then we looked up at the Leaning Tower of Pisa. So I just sort of put those two together into my eyes being one on the TV and one on the Tower of Pisa, but physically impossible to actually have happened. Besides the aforementioned tragedy, I had the time of my life in Europe, and meeting these individuals became more important to me than finishing the book. They all opened their houses and their lives to me. Yes, I had been in a band that they all liked. Yes, they had questions they wanted answered, but that kind of enthusiasm only lasts so long in conversations before the relationship have to move into another territory, like whether or not you like hanging out with these people, and whether or not they like hanging out with you. I made some friends that will always be in my life, whether in spirit or in the flesh. Pretty much all the people I just talked about I still do meet. Kevin from the Apers I see quite often, and we were actually in Japan together for a short while and had a really good time there. And then I played with him at the Raduno Festival in Italy last year. And then, back into the book, then I say, and I didn't finish the book. So now, 3 years later, 6 years after beginning the process, I finally finished the book while sitting in a 24-hour bagel shop in Brooklyn, New York. And even though I feel like putting away the computer and not writing anything else for at least a month, not even my name, I continue on with this foreword to say that I could not have completed this book without the inspiration from and persistent nudging and relentless complaining from the following people and bands. Yes, I was staying with my friend Molly Flynn out in Sunset Park in Brooklyn. I had helped start the second incarnation of the Neo-Futurists in New York. So I had been staying there a lot when I finished this book. So here's the thanks. The Mangies, Mas, Andrea, and Manuel. And they had a rotating of other guitarists in the band, so I don't think I put them all here. The Pee-wees. Then I have Giorgio and Ernesto. Giorgio is one of Mass's best friends, and I love the guy. He reminds me of I can't remember his name now, so I won't go down that road. But he's really a passionate man. He's one of the Italians that actually talks with his hands like this. Super, super smart, and not a musician, just a fan of music. And those people always impress me. The ones that have no instinct to want to play, but that music is their life anyway. He actually lives in Milan right now and is trying to move back to Sarzana, which is where Mass and him are from. Very beautiful castle town not far from La Spezia. Then it says Ernesto. Ernesto was my friend in... I should have done some more restudying of this before I just started talking, but I wanted it to be spontaneous. Livorno. Yeah, Ernesto lives in Livorno, and I visited him. And actually, when I published the book, he invited me there to read chapters of it. So my friend Stefanino translated it, and I read in English, but people were able to follow along with a cool little booklet that they made in Italian. So that was a really cool experience. And I basically read a few parts, and then I was like, damn, I mean, they could read this on their own. I just said, I just want to take questions. So I think we talked about Screeching Weasel and touring for about an hour, and it was a lot of fun. And they were translating questions for me. So that's Ernesto. And I also saw him at the Bergamo Festival too, and I stayed with him in Livorno. And that was great. Then the Popsters, which I've talked about before, Stefanino, Bizio, Topo. Oh, Topo was this crazy artist who lived in Palermo, and Toponino, they would call him, I think, which means little mouse. Cinzia and Azura and Joe. These are all the people that I love from Palermo, and they're all scattered all over the winds right now. Cinzia, I think, is in Berlin, and Azura lives in Milan. And Joe, I think, is the only one who's still in Palermo. He reminds me of my friend Peter Flynn, so I worry about him a lot because they're both extreme drinkers, but also intelligent, really likable, passionate people. So he's always in my mind and my heart. So Marco and Tina were in Palermo. Then I think they're back in Rome right now. They came to visit me here in Chicago. He owns a record label and also a record store where I also read the book. So I did 2 readings in Italy. I don't know if this is interesting, but I'll go on. The Apers, I talked about. David Vricki, who is in Antwerp. I talked about him. Livy and Stefan in Rotterdam. Livy now lives in England, and I get to see her occasionally. And Stefan, who runs Stardom Records, which he's putting out the first vinyl ever of Even in Blackouts recently, so I definitely still deal with him all the time. Very good fellow. Angelica in Nuremberg, I put her in because that on that trip, I just lost myself for a while, and I went to all over Germany because I spoke a little German, but not a lot. So, and I love castles, and they have a lot of cool looking dark castles in Germany. So I went to Nuremberg, and I met this girl who I hung out with for a day, and then I don't know. I think it was just my place in my life there. I just romantically fell in love with this girl, even though I didn't know her, and she accidentally blew me off the next day before I had to leave, and I wrote her a long letter when I got back about how I liked her so much, and it's kind of ridiculous now, but she responded back, and she said she didn't know any of that, and we stayed in contact over the years, but rarely anymore. But we still we made it through that weird time, and I still correspond with her occasionally. She was a big Star Trek fan, so I sent her an old VHS of I think one of her favorite episodes was the Truffles. The one about the little furry figurines. Anyway, then there's Noel and John and Colm in Ireland. I actually didn't know them through music. I knew them through theater. My friend Pam went to a theater event and workshop in England, and they met. And when I was in Ireland, he said I could stay with him, and had an amazing drunken time drinking cider in Dublin. And Simon and Dawn, who I talked about, and Graham in Scotland. Graham set up some shows for Even in Blackouts a little bit later, and Graham also moved to Chicago for a while. And he does some writing about horror movies, a lot about writing about horror movies and novels. He's a smart guy, a little bit nuts, and that's why I kind of like him. And the Lillingtons, I thank, of course. Cody. Ooh, I spelled with a C-O-D-Y. Oh, he never said that to me. Sure, I'm surprised he hasn't thrown that back in my face. Corey and Tim. Even though a lot of I don't talk about Tim much in the book because it was a mixed. I went on two different tours. One with Tim in the early days, and then I went on with one with the drummer who replaced him for a while, and I can't remember his name right now. So I didn't want to be specific with mentioning Tim's name much because I didn't know I didn't want to mistake him with the other fella. But Tim is he's in the band now, and he's also a big fan of the book, so he must feel himself present in the book, even though I don't talk about him much. And then I got a bunch of other thank yous, but this is all people from the Neo-Futurists I mentioned, and then Kasha and Donovan were friends of mine who through the Neo-Futurists, and Kasha is the one who actually edited my book. Then I have a bunch of other people. Ryan O'Shea, who's been friends with me for years and years, met me through the band, and I think he stayed at my house. Peter Flynn, who passed away. A bunch of other people. Chris Barrows, of course. I mean, how could I write something about punk and not thank Mr. Chris Barrows from the Pink Lincolns? And Ben Foster, of course, is here. And Dan Schaefer and Master Genie. All of the Weasel people. Lumley, Zach, Gubb. Who Gubb was? He wasn't even. We weren't even doing even blackouts when I finished this. So that's kind of cool that I have Gubb in here. Warren. And Gubb is the only character in the book, besides this other woman who I'll probably talk about later, who actually have their real names. Because I thought Gubb was so extreme already that I should just call him Gubb. And Gubb is Gubb, no matter whether you're talking about him fictionally or in reality. Then I thank all the labels and Lookout Records, Fat Records, Knock Knock Records, Subordination Records, where they did the Subordination Fest, where Mopes played the first year. Oh, I think even in Blackouts, so we must have started already. But Gubb wasn't in the band yet then. So, because I have the band members here, Liz and Bice, Brad and Dan. And I thank my mom and my sisters and my brother and my other brother and my cat and Matt Nelson, who has passed away, sadly. Jim Sella, who I own this house with. Omar and Kathy. Omar and Kathy are my two best friends from my life. And then a bunch of others here. And Molly, I thanked her because we were together at the time, and I used to be able to stay with her family a lot in Boston or Massachusetts, and I think I did a lot of the writing there. So that's the foreword. So here's to get a few things straight without putting them in the comments. I thought I'd put them on the video instead. First off, Bark Like a Dog was actually designed by Benton Jew out of San Francisco and Los Angeles, who actually has quite a lot of credits to his name. Comic book designer, and he even worked on a lot of movies too. The one that Les Toyle designed, who is used for Fat Records a lot, he designed Teen Punks in Heat, which is the second one I mentioned. Also, I should straighten my timeline for Even and Blackouts is weird. We actually started in 2001, which is right after I got back from that trip that I talk about in the foreword, in the preface, where I spent time with the Mangees and the Popsters. I actually came home. I wrote the song Missing Manifesto while sitting in that apartment that they got me in Palermo. And when I got home, I started searching out people to be in Even and Blackouts. And then Gubb started in the band in about 2006. So by the time this was done, I had not run into Gubb yet in the record store, which is how he ended up joining Even in Blackouts. So I had put him in the book as Gubb and published it before I even ran into him a year later. I don't even think he was aware he was in there. I think I showed it to him after he joined the band. So that's it. I think that's all the corrections I need to make. If I need to make more, I'll make them on other episodes. Thanks.